A massive wall of fire ripped through the morning air, and windows in New Jersey shattered into 1,000 pieces. On January 3, 1944, the USS Turner turned into a giant ball of flames right in New York Harbor. It did not take a torpedo or a bomb from a plane to do it. The ship was ripped apart from the inside out while the crew was preparing for simple drills. Most people look right past this part of history, but the mystery of why it happened is deeper than the harbor itself. Vanished in New York Harbor. Even though this tragedy happened back in 1944, the story is far from over. In 2017, a group of researchers started looking into the files of the sailors who were on that ship. They found a big problem that had been ignored for a very long time. When the ship went down, the Navy said that 136 men were missing. But if you take away all the noise, it's about this. Some of those men might have been buried in unmarked graves right under our noses. To put it in simple words, the families were told their loved ones were lost at sea. But a man named Ted Darcy found papers that showed something very different. He found that at least 4 men were buried as unknown sailors in a cemetery on Long Island. They were found after the explosion, but nobody bothered to check who they were. This changed everything, no question about it. It means that for decades, families have been visiting empty spots while their sons were lying in the dirt just a few miles away. The part that trips everyone up is the paperwork. During the war, things moved fast, and mistakes were made. But even as late as 2025, new records have come to light through special requests. These logs show that the Navy might have known exactly where some of these men were. There were reports of remains being found that were never shared with the public. It makes you wonder why they would keep that a secret for so long. Was it just a mistake, or were they trying to hide something about the explosion itself? The search for the truth is still going on today. Scientists are now using DNA to try and match these unknown sailors to their families. It is a slow process, and it is not even close to being finished. Every time they find a new piece of the puzzle, it leads back to that cold morning in January. People are still looking for answers because they want to know if their grandfathers died because of a mistake or something much worse. The mystery of the missing men is just the tip of the iceberg. Wait, there is one big problem that still stands in the way of the truth. Even with new tools, some of the records from that day are still locked away. The Navy says it is for safety, but researchers think it is because the ship was carrying things it should not have had. As we look at the modern search for these lost souls, we have to go back to the moment the world shook. But the metal was hiding a secret that would only come out decades later. Waking up to terror. Let's switch gears for a second and look at the actual morning of the disaster. It was about 6:19 in the morning. The sun was not even up yet and the air was freezing. The USS Turner was sitting near the Ambrose lightship, which is only about 8 miles away from the big city of New York. The crew was just starting their day, thinking they were finally safe after a long time at sea. They had been protecting ships in the ocean and were finally back in home waters. Here is the tiny detail that almost everyone misses. The ship did not just have one explosion. It was a chain reaction that started deep inside the hull. The first blast happened in a room where they kept Mark 22 rockets. These were powerful weapons, and for some reason one of them went off. It blew a hole in the side of the ship that was between 4 and 6 feet wide. That is a huge hole for a ship that is only about 376 feet long. When you look at the real facts, the chaos was instant. The first blast took out most of the high-ranking officers. This left the younger sailors to try and save the ship all by themselves. They were jumping into water that was almost freezing. Believe it or not, it gets even weirder because the explosions did not stop. More blasts ripped through the ammunition rooms and the ship started to sink by the back end. It took less than 2 hours for the whole thing to disappear under the waves. People on the shore in New Jersey and Staten Island thought they were being attacked. The shock waves were so strong that they broke windows in houses miles away. Debris, which is just broken pieces of the ship, actually rained down on people's yards. It was a scene of total terror in a place that was supposed to be a quiet harbor. The ship was only 10 months old and it was supposed to be one of the best destroyers in the fleet. But it's not as easy as it looks to explain why it sank so fast. Most ships like this are built to take a hit, but the Turner fell apart like it was made of paper. Survivors talked about a strange smell and a feeling that the ship was sick before it ever blew up. Some men even begged to be let off the ship when they were at their last stop, because they felt something terrible was coming. It makes you wonder if the ship was doomed from the day it was built. No one knew that the real danger was sitting right under their feet. Power of a Fletcher ship. Fast forward a little bit and things look totally different when you see how this ship was made. The USS Turner was a Fletcher-class destroyer. These were the workhorses of the Navy. It was built in a place called Kearney, New Jersey, and it cost millions of dollars to put together. It had 5 big guns and 10 tubes for firing torpedoes. It was also very fast, able to go about 35 knots, which is really quick for a ship of that size. If you take away all the noise, it's about this. The ship was a floating warehouse for explosives. It carried depth charges for sinking submarines, rockets for attacking land, and thousands of rounds of ammo for its big guns. It weighed over 2,000 tons when it was empty and almost 3,000 tons when it was full of fuel and supplies. It was 376 feet and 5 inches long with a width of 39 feet and 2 inches. This was a lot of power packed into a small space. Most folks have no idea that life on a ship like this was very crowded. There were about 300 men living in tiny spaces. They worked around the clock to keep the engines running and the guns ready. The ship had 2 giant turbines that could produce 60,000 horsepower. To say it was big is not even the half of it. It was a masterpiece of engineering for its time, but all that power became its own worst enemy when things went wrong. The ship had a very important job before it arrived in New York. It spent its time in the Atlantic Ocean making sure troop ships made it to North Africa. It was a dangerous job because German submarines were everywhere. The crew had to be on high alert every single second. They were used to the sound of alarms and the feeling of the ship shaking from depth charges. That is why being back in the harbor felt like such a relief. They thought they could finally breathe. But here is where it gets tricky. Even though the ship was new, it was working in very rough conditions. The salt water and the constant moving can wear down even the strongest metal. Some experts think that the way the weapons were stored was the real problem. They were packed in so tight that if one thing went wrong, everything would go wrong. The ship was basically a giant bomb, waiting for a tiny spark to set it off. The records were gone, but the bodies were still waiting to be found. Answers that never came. While everyone was looking over here, this was happening in the background, unfolding in the dark, cold corners of a Navy bureaucracy that was more concerned with its image than the truth. After the ship finally sank beneath the choppy surface of the harbor, leaving only a slick of oil and debris behind, the Navy scrambled to figure out exactly what had gone wrong. They held a formal meeting to look at the evidence, a board of inquiry meant to provide answers, but they could never agree on one single cause. The room was filled with high-ranking officers and technical experts, yet the more they talked, the more the truth seemed to slip through their fingers. Some people in that room argued that it was because the crew was being careless with the rockets, perhaps mishandling the volatile munitions in the haste of wartime operations. Others thought the ammunition was simply too old and had become chemically unstable over time, essentially turning the ship into a floating time bomb, waiting for the slightest jar to set it off. There was even a persistent rumor that a German submarine had managed to sneak past the harbor defenses and fired a torpedo into the unsuspecting vessel, a theory that sent chills through the coastal communities. Plain and simple, the Navy did not want to admit they did not know the answer. To confess ignorance was to admit a vulnerability they couldn't afford during the height of a global conflict. They eventually released an official statement saying it was an accident, but they did not give many details, leaving the public and the survivors with more questions than answers. This was during the war, so they kept a lot of things secret under the guise of national security, ostensibly so the enemy would not find out about our structural weaknesses or failures in protocol. But that wall of secrecy hurt the families the most. They were left in a state of perpetual limbo, never given a real explanation for why their sons, brothers, and husbands did not come home from what should have been a safe harbor. The part that nobody talks about, the part that remains buried in the footnotes of maritime history, is that the ship was eventually salvaged. It was pulled up piece by piece over the course of a long, grueling year, a mechanical autopsy performed in the mud and the dark. During the salvage operation, the divers and engineers found parts of the crew, but many of them were in very bad shape, ravaged by the explosion and the time spent submerged. Some of the internal reports from the recovery teams even whispered that the remains were radioactive because of the specific types of experimental weapons or equipment on board. This is a chilling detail that was kept out of the newspapers for a long time, hidden away in classified folders that gathered dust for decades. Instead of giving these men a proper identification and a personal farewell, the military buried what they found in mass graves and marked them simply as unknown. Most people look right past this part of the story, focusing instead on the dramatic explosion or the tactical loss of the ship. But it is actually the most important part of the entire tragedy. It shows how the men who served were often treated like just another piece of equipment, replaceable and easily discarded once they were no longer functional to the war effort. The part that makes absolutely no sense, even when you look at it through the lens of wartime chaos, is why they did not use the sailors' dental records or dog tags to identify them. They had the information sitting in filing cabinets just a few miles away. They had the technology and the records to give these men their names back. Instead, they chose to leave them as mysteries. Perhaps because it was faster or because they didn't want to draw any more attention to the gruesome nature of the recovery. It was not until 2025 that some of these files were finally opened to the public, nearly a century after the event took place. These files showed that the Navy had a lot more information than they ever told the families, including detailed descriptions of where remains were found and clues that could have easily led to identifications decades ago. It has been a long, painful road for the descendants of those sailors, but the truth is finally starting to leak out through the cracks in the old files like water through a rusted hull. Do you think the Navy was right to keep these secrets during the war? Could this happen again with the ships we have today? Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you found this story interesting, make sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep look into history's biggest mysteries.